I got the idea for the song when I saw the memes about the Twingo in some Initial D groups. I think it was mostly in Initial D hell, from which I'm banned now and I have no idea why. But anyway, it was there where someone said there should be a Eurobeat song about the Twingo, and I immediately remembered that I had the idea already, so I thought now is the time to do it. So I first thought about the mood of the song, and I wanted it to be joyful, just like the face of the Twingo, energetic and rockish. Then I thought about the melody. The first things that came to my mind were the guitar riff and the basic melody which I used in the synth hook part. I will show you the basic melody before I show you the intro, because I actually built the intro around that melody, even though you don't hear it anymore. So after I built the intro around this melody, I copied it onto another track and let it run through an arpeggiated patch. Arpeggiated means that you don't hear the actual note that is being given as an input, but a sequence of notes based on a certain pattern and the input notes or chords. So with that, you don't hear the actual melody anymore, but rather a chopped up version of it. Here you can see the notes of the original melody, but what you hear is the arpeggiator. I played the notes on my keyboard and then quantized them if you wonder about the unequal length of the notes. I wanted the song to start with some Twingo engine sound, so I went on YouTube to find some original engine sounds and sampled them. That's actually always a good thing if you need a certain sound. Just go on YouTube and type in some keywords about what you're looking for. Just make sure to look if a sound is copyrighted or not. Mostly you can see that in the description or in the license type of the video. So here's the engine sound. All in all, it sounds nice, but it misses something. Have you noticed it? It misses the engine start sound. So because I couldn't find one of a Twingo, I used a sample I had in Reason. It is one of the factory sound patches of Reason. I will show you which one I used. It is the DigiEffects B patch for the NNXT. To make it sound natural, I added a fade in to the original Twingo engine sound. Together they sound like this. Now, that's what I call a good engine start, right? And then the engine sound fades into a pad sound which plays the basic notes of the chords. So one thing that's very important about intros is that they build up. So I added some other chord related tones in the second part of the intro. So I already talked about the guitar riff, and this is one of the few times where I didn't improvise the guitar, but wrote the notes of the guitar first, because I already had exactly in mind what the guitar should play. So to make the arrangement I started with a MIDI guitar and then later recorded the real guitar. What you're gonna hear now is the MIDI guitar, which you don't hear in the final song later. I don't like the sound of MIDI guitars, so I recorded it with a real guitar, and it sounds like this. So mostly I use Guitar Rig for my guitar sounds, and this one is a patch called Straightforward Metal. I also added some equalizing and some effects like reverb, delay and chorus. Another nice thing to do in an intro is to add some drum accents, but not the full drum pattern which you will hear later in the song. To do this, I used some slices of the famous Allman Brothers drum solo, which are included in the drum and bass kit 01 of the Groove Agent SE included in Cubase. But I think you can also buy it separately and use it in any other DAW which supports the VST format. So the drums start very simple and then build up. So here we already have the offbeat hi-hat pattern, which is typical for Eurobeat. The famous Eurobeat pumping comes from several elements playing together, and the offbeat hi-hat is one of them. Another important offbeat element of Eurobeat is the bass. Typically for Eurobeat is an FM bass sound, which you can get with Dext, for example. Dext is a free plugin which emulates the Yamaha DX7, and it's really one of the easiest ways to get a good sounding Eurobeat bass, like this. You should just take care not to use too much velocity, otherwise the bass will sound very sharp. Like this. So I'm gonna put the velocity back down again. And so yeah, this is a very basic Eurobeat bass pattern, but very effective, I'd say. So now there are different ways to go from the intro into the synth hook, and the method I used here is to use a transition. I wanted to use a Hoover sound in this song because I think Running in the 90s is the only Eurobeat song which used that kind of sound so far. And I don't really understand why, because it's really nice. And it always reminds me of that Rotterdam Gabba, which I really enjoyed in the 90s. And still do enjoy nowadays. So I did some research about how the sound is made, and I tried to rebuild it in Reason, using the Tor instrument. So it is made of 3 different saw waves, and they use a detune setting and are all playing in different octaves. I also added some effects for the mod wheel and the aftertouch, so I can play around with the sound a bit when I play it on my keyboard. So this is the result of my programming. Yeah, and the pattern ends where the synth hook begins, which I will cover in part 2. But for now there are still things to do in the intro or the transition part. First we have to tweak some things so the listener will know that the song is going to explode soon. So what's better for that than a reverse explosion? So usually I like to introduce one of the most upbeat parts of a song, which is mostly the chorus or the synth hook part, with an explosion sound or something similar. And it can add a nice effect if you reverse that sound and play the reverse sound before. So it's pretty obvious that I first had to choose an explosion sound for that. And once again, I used a sound in Reason, one from the factory sound bank, which is a Tor patch called A-Bomb. And there are quite a lot of good impact sounds in the factory sound bank of Reason. So this one sounds like this. So when I had that explosion, I rendered it as an audio file, and then I took that audio file and put a reverse setting on it. In Cubase you find it in the audio menu, in the menu bar. So let's have a listen how the explosion sounds backwards. Nice. So that's pretty much everything for the intro so far. So let's have a listen how it all sounds together now. Oh, I forgot one thing which is also kind of part of the transition. I used another Twingo engine sound but with higher revs, and it fades into the synth hook. And with fade I mean that the RPM and so the pitch starts low and then goes up. So that's pretty much it for the intro. There are many different kinds of ways to build a Eurobeat intro, and taking one of the main melodies is just one of them. Some Eurobeat songs have completely different intros than the main song, and some others start upbeat right away. But what I think is most important is that the intro really builds up. At every repetition of the pattern, something new must come into it, until it fully explodes into the synth hook, or main riff, or whatever you want to call it. As you can hear, the song transforms into something extremely energetic. I like to compare the feeling with someone driving in a town, which would be the intro, and then finally sees the town exit sign, pushes the throttle, and whoosh, the acceleration kicks in. That's exactly how the main riff part should feel like. It is relatively easy to achieve this once you understood how the elements have to play together to get this effect. It depends on a powerful rhythm section as well as on a strong melody or chord pattern, which is played by many different synth layers. And even though the part is only 8 bars long, I can tell you it will be enough for the second part of this tutorial, because we're talking about 18 tracks playing together at the same time. First, I want to look with you at the drums, then talk about the melodic elements, and then I will show you how the other rhythmic elements come in to give it the final Eurobeat feel. The drums are actually one MIDI track but 3 output tracks, one for each sound. So what we have here is a bass drum, a hi-hat, and a crash cymbal. And together they play this pattern. So as you can hear, the cymbals play only some accents, and the timing of those has to do with the melody, which I will show you soon. So for now, simply remember that. The kick and the hi-hats play a simple pattern except for those kick rolls, which are also part of the accentuation. The melodic parts are all built on the basic melody I showed you in the first part, but they have some drastic changes. The arpeggiated version of it is one of the layers here too. A Roland D50 bell sound called Staccato Heaven plays the original melody. But just like that, the melody isn't very exciting, so I had to add some layers with more rhythmic play. I choose a rather percussive synth sound with a strong attack and added some shorter notes on the melodic pattern which play around the melody and chords. As you will hear now, the same melody sounds already a lot more playful than before. It's playful now, but still very thin. To give it more thickness, I copied the same melody to 2 other tracks with different synth sounds and also changed the octaves of the melody. One of the sounds I used is the same Hoover sound which I used in the intro. The Hoover alone sounds like this. It's thick, but it lacks attack. We can fix this with another synth sound. And this one has that typical squeaky attack you know from many Eurobeat songs. You can achieve this with an envelope on the pitch with only a very short decay and nothing else. So let's listen now how these 3 layers of the advanced melody sound together. Nice, now let's also add the arpeggiator and the original melody with the bell sound. So this sounds already very rich and we could leave it like that. But I wanted more. I wanted some parts of the melody to sound even more thick and give them a stronger accentuation. Adding more layers of the exact same pattern would not do the trick. Instead, I choose to add some chords to some of the notes of the melody. For chords, I love the Super Velobrass patch of Reason's Tour. It has a very nice basic sound and you can play around a lot with the velocity and with the modulation to give it some more variety. As you can see here, I added a vibrato on the longer chords. You will hear the difference when I play it alone. While the basic sound is very nice, I still like to add another synth which gives a bit more life to the higher frequencies. The patch Follow Me of Steinberg's Retrologue does the trick for me here. The only difference to the Super Velobrass pattern is that I don't use modulation here. So now we're gonna listen to the richness of both sounds playing together. We could also add some higher or lower octaves of the chords pattern, but this has already been done with the melody pattern. And remember that the chords should only give an accent and not take over the dominant part of the hook. Of course this can be done though, and it is done in many Eurobeat songs. But one great thing about Eurobeat is that it offers the potential for a huge variety of possibilities. So now let's listen to all the synth layers together. Yeah, now I'm very satisfied with the hook. But I can hear some parts which still could get a stronger accentuation. Do you remember the crash cymbals? It's exactly at these points where a stronger accentuation is needed in my opinion. So we already have the crash cymbals for that, but I also like to add some orchestral hits. I use the orchestral hits of Steinberg's Helion Sonic. These got a very strong attack. And now let's listen together with the drums and the cymbal accents too. You can hear they're not always playing exactly the same thing, which gives it even more liveliness. And I think we're pretty much done with the accentuation and the melodic parts. So let's make sure and listen to all we got so far together, when I finished selecting all the needed tracks. Now, the song still needs that rhythmic pumping for which Eurobeat is famous. We have to add the bass line we already had in the intro to get that. We play the basic tones of the chords on the offbeats. D minor, B flat, C, D minor, B flat, A. Let's hear drums and bass together. That's already quite nice. The bass and the hi-hat together give already a strong accentuation of the offbeats in the low and high range. But we should also get it in the mid-range. To get that, I like to use some percussive chords which play at the offbeats. I programmed a synth for that in Reason store, and I will show you how it is made. The sound basically uses 3 sawtooth waves, which are slightly detuned to each other. But the most important part is the envelope, which controls the pitch. I use a very short decay setting, and attack, sustain and release are set to 0. When this envelope controls the oscillator pitch, you get a very high pitch at the beginning of the sound, which goes down to the original pitch in some milliseconds. With that, we'll have a very strong and squeaky attack, which is nice for the offbeat. And I'm gonna show you the difference if I take away the envelope from the pitch. Because like that, you'll only have a very basic sawtooth synth sound. And it wouldn't add too much to the song if you play this at the offbeats. I mean, it's not a bad sound, but it lacks aggressiveness, and aggressiveness is something you really want in Eurobeat. So I'm gonna put the envelope control back up, and we're gonna listen to it again with the envelope on the pitch. And you can get a similar sound with almost every synth that allows you to route the envelope to the pitch of the oscillator. So now let's listen what the offbeat synth adds to the rhythmic pattern of the song. And there's another thing we can do to let the song sound even more fast, and it is to add some 16th note pattern to it. The pattern is a variation of notes which are part of the chords which play, and it sounds like this. It's important to use a very short percussive sound here. Now that we got all elements for the synth hook together, let's listen to the complete synth hook. So we talked about the engine sound and the explosion in the first part of the series already, that's why I didn't repeat it in the second part. If you didn't watch the first part, I'd absolutely recommend to do it, because you can never overestimate the effect of a good intro. So let's now talk about variation. The first and the second time the synth hook plays, it's 8 bars long. After the first chorus, it plays without the engine sound. And after the second chorus, the synth hook plays 16 bars. The first 8 bars are without the engine sound again, and the second 8 bars are with the engine sound to give it a bit of variation. So let's listen to the difference now. And we have the same 16 bars at the end of the song, but this time it fades out when the engine comes in. So it sounds like this. As we're gonna talk about the verse, pre-chorus and chorus today and in the next part, we should start with the lyrics to get an idea about the structure of a Eurobeat song. So just let me find the lyrics and then we're gonna talk about them in detail. So what's very typical for Eurobeat is that the lyrics got a very strong chorus. And mostly the chorus is longer than the verse or the pre-chorus part. Also, most of the choruses have a catchy phrase which is repeated several times. And in this case it's of course the Merci Twingo phrase which is repeated throughout the chorus. Then usually Eurobeat song gets 2 different verse parts. And the pre-chorus mostly stays the same when it's repeated later in the song. Well, most Eurobeat songs are made like this, but it's not a law or anything. If you want to put more variation into it, it's fine. Well, the usual formula is 4 lines for the verse, and then we have another 4 lines for the pre-chorus. And as the pre-chorus leads to the chorus, it is good to have some text that functions like a bridge between the verse and the chorus. As the verse changes over the song and the chorus remains the same, it is good to use some rather universal text. While most lyrics you find in the internet are following the structure of the song, for Eurobeat it is typical just to write down every different part once. I don't know why that is, but I keep the structure here. Although the structure in the song is verse, pre-chorus, chorus, second verse, pre-chorus, chorus, pre-chorus, chorus, second verse, pre-chorus, chorus. And for the content of the lyrics, well, I played around with some typical French stereotypes and also made some references to initial D, like the delivery, but this time it's not a tofu delivery, but delivery of baguette and wine, which is typical for France. Eurobeat lyrics don't need a deeper sense. Most of them are simply built around words or phrases that sound cool, and that's totally fine. So then now let's go back into the music part, and we will begin with the verse part, which is made of 8 bars. The pre-chorus part also has 8 bars, so both together are 16 bars. The chorus also has 16 bars, so that gives you already an idea about the relation of verse and chorus in a Eurobeat song. Personally, I like to experiment with the structure of a song, but if you want to keep it classic, that's fine, and at least it will give you a little guarantee of not too boring songwriting, because you have to create at least 3 different parts. So, like in the last part of the series, we will take a look at the drums first. In this song, the drums are simpler in the verse and pre-chorus than in the other parts. But it's not a necessity. You should do some variations depending on the melody and the text and whatever you want to express. So here we have the really simple 4-on-the-floor bass drum and offbeat hi-hat pattern. Also, the bass and the offbeat synth continue to play on the offbeat, of course. But this time the chords have changed a bit. In the verse we have this: D minor, B flat, F, C, D minor, B flat, F, A. And even though the song is in D minor, the A is a major chord. The guitar also plays a different pattern. This time I improvised the guitar, so I don't have a MIDI file for it. But some parts are similar to the intro and synth hook part, because they play around the same chords. The first bar in D minor is an example for that. Listen to the verse and the synth hook. The accompaniment in the verse is much thinner than in the synth hook part, of course, because the vocals are in the foreground. Still, we need some elements to fill the song, also in the sung parts. And we have to build it up again from the verse to the chorus. For the verse, I like to use simple melodies or arpeggios. So here we have a kind of arpeggio, which I played on the keyboard. Here you can see the notes, and it sounds like this. And as you can see and hear, it also supports the offbeat characteristics of the song. What I also like to do is to fill the song with a pad sound, playing just the chords in full bars. So here I used a rather soft pad sound from Alien Sonic. The patch is called Dark Room, and it sounds like this. So it has a really slow attack and it sounds very mild. So to give the pads a bit more life and movement, I copied them to a track which runs through another arpeggiator. And it sounds like this. What's interesting here is that it's not the notes which are arpeggiated, but a gate which opens and closes, following a pattern. And of course what's most important for the verse is the vocals. So in the verse I usually use a simple lead vocal line without any background vocals. Those come later in the pre-chorus and in the chorus. So this is the first verse.
On my way home from the boulangerie, I saw a special car and it smiled to me. My croissant fell to the ground when the engine played that happy sound.
Well, there are some singers who usually use background vocals all over the song, but this depends on many things, like the sound of the voice, if it's rather thin or powerful, and also on the melody. Some just sound better with a choir. One singer who uses background vocals a lot is Odyssey, and I think it works very well with his voice and with the melodies he uses usually. So let's go into the pre-chorus part. One interesting thing is that it is the only part which doesn't begin with the D minor but with the submedian chord, which is B flat. The function of this is to have a variation and also focus on the bridge function of the song. I would have to go deeper into music theory to explain this, but I'd save that for another tutorial. So let's listen. B flat, C, F, D minor, B flat, C, A. So yeah, here we have again the A major chord, which is not part of the natural D minor scale, but part of the harmonic D minor scale. So here it functions as the dominant, and the dominant usually is a chord which seeks to dissolute into the tonic chord. which is D minor in this case. And as you can see, the pattern of the bass and the offbeat synth remains the same. So as these chords are completely different than in the other parts, beginning with the submedian chord, I also wanted to change the pattern of the guitar completely at this part of the song. Once again, it is completely improvised, so I don't have a MIDI for this part. But I think you will clearly hear that the guitar is completely different than in all the other parts you heard before. Yeah, the guitar is completely palm muted and plays some kind of arpeggio here. In the pre-chorus I also want the melodic synths to play a bit more playful than in the verse part. So the arpeggio I used here is less repetitive and has a higher range of notes. And it uses the follow me sound which we already had for the chords in the synth hook. As you can see, it is only 6 bars long. That has to do with the A major chord seeking for the dissolution, for which I use a slightly different pattern. Also, I added another arpeggiator here, so the song sounds a little bit richer than in the verse part. And yeah, to the vocals I added some background vocals, but not all the time, only for some accents. So here are the vocals all together for you.
From the Alps to the Pyrenees, the four-wheel wonder from Paris makes you happy on its way. Come on, everybody say.
For the background vocals I usually use tones from the chords so they are in harmony together.
The four-wheel wonder from Paris. Come on, everybody say.
So I'm gonna let you hear the lead vocals without the background vocals so you can hear the difference.
From the Alps to the Pyrenees, the four-wheel wonder from Paris makes you happy on its way. Come on, everybody say.
So yeah, I already said that the one synth goes only 6 bars long, and for the last part I use a sweeping pad instead. Sweeping means that there is a cutoff filter which opens up more and more. So this was the first verse and pre-chorus, but as I repeat these parts several times in the song, I also want to add some variation there. So let's look at the other parts. In the second verse, of course the lyrics change, but I also made some changements in the drums and in the guitar. Let's look at the drums first. So I think you can already guess where the guitar plays different too. Yeah, and this time I also added some background vocals already in the verse to give an accent on the word Champs-Élysées. It's always good to have some variations in a song with many repetitions.
Need a yacht in Saint-Tropez when I ride my Twingo on the Champs-Élysées, Monte Carlo and Le Mans.
And after the second chorus and the synth hook which comes afterwards, we have another variation of the pre-chorus part. And this time it's not full blast, but it starts a little bit quieter, and this is done with, for example, the drums playing something different. So here the bass drum doesn't play its usual pattern, but also like the cymbal only on some accents. And yeah, then the hi-hat comes in with the usual pattern for the last bar, and it goes into the next 4 bars, which are the usual pattern you know from before. The rest stays pretty much the same, but you will hear that it makes a huge difference just using different drums for the first 4 bars. While the bass and the offbeat synth and all the rest stays exactly the same.
From the Alps to the Pyrenees, the four-wheel wonder from Paris makes you happy on its way. Come on, everybody say.
And then after the third chorus and the synth hook which comes afterwards, we have another repetition of the second verse and the pre-chorus. This time I use a distortion effect on my voice, so it is not exactly the same as first time it was played. I make the distortion using guitar rig as well, but this time not with a guitar patch but with a special effects patch.
Meet a yacht in Saint-Tropez when I ride my Twingo on the Champs-Élysées. Monte Carlo and Le Mans, the world's laughing, oh, oh, oh.
The arrangement is also somewhat reduced here, having no drums at all and just the guitar and the melody and pad playing. So without vocals, the arrangement at this part sounds like this. And yeah, this is something I forgot to show you in the second verse part. I also used a sample of the Twingo honk sound here. Sorry, here it is alone. And it plays at the same time I sing on on on. So it's one of the comedic parts of the song, I'd say.
Oh, oh, oh.
And yeah, this was pretty much it for the verse and the pre-chorus. The chorus together with the synth hook may be the most important part of a Eurobeat song. A good chorus and synth hook can decide if a song sounds powerful or not. So here you should really spend a lot of attention to the detail. Important for the chorus is that it sounds much richer than the verse and the pre-chorus. You really need to get the impression that the chorus is the climax of the song. It should be catchy and not necessarily easy to sing along, but at least the listener have to get the impression that he could sing it along. Of course, Eurobeat is rather a demanding genre for the vocalist, but it sounds easy to sing. And I think when these two elements come together, you got a good recipe for a very catchy song. So what elements have we got here for the chorus? We got the guitar once again, and as the chords are exactly the same as in the intro and synth hook, the guitar also plays the same. The guitar could of course play some variations, but as I think the guitar riff is quite nice and catchy, I decided to keep it the same here. So we got that already. What I like to do in a chorus is, besides background vocals for accentuation of certain parts, I also like to use some synth sounds to give an accentuation on the catchphrase of the song. Well, this depends on the melody, but for Merci Twingo it works absolutely fine. So I use a synth 1 here, one of the famous Euronam sounds. And I think if you were already into Eurobeat production, you certainly heard of that sound bank before. It is made by my friend Heinam, and I can totally recommend to download it. You will get the link in the description. So here I use some Eurosaw to support the Merci Twingo part. And now together with the vocals.
Merci Twingo, The baguette and the wine will be delivered in no time. Merci Twingo. Tell me quelle est ta couleur? You smell like parfum de fleurs. Merci Twingo.
Of course you need a tight vocal timing here, otherwise it would sound very confusing instead. The background vocals follow the entire melody of the chorus, so altogether it sounds like this.
Merci Twingo. The baguette and the wine will be delivered in no time. Merci Twingo.
As the chorus is one of the climax parts of the song, I also use the explosion I use in the synth hook part for the beginning of every 8 bars of the chorus. And now listen how the dominant chord of the pre-chorus and the explosion already alone give the impression of a climax part of the song. So you see, even though there are loads of sounds in a Eurobeat song, it's the small details which really make the difference. Also we got again that 16th synth here. And another thing I totally like to do in a chorus is to write a counter melody to the sung melody, which plays at the same time. To avoid confusion, I rather use a soft tone for that counter melody and let it play more in the background. So here I choose a sound which seems like a mixture of strings and a bell. The attack is more bellish while the release is more like a string sound. The sound comes from a Fairlight Reason sound bank. Sounds like this are also as important as the brass sounds. So yeah, a counter melody like this really adds a lot to the atmosphere of the chorus. And I think it's a nice addition to using pads. Of course it is more work than just using pads or an arpeggio, but I think laziness is not really something which is useful when you try to make Eurobeat. And as we're talking about laziness, like the synth hook part, a chorus needs a lot of accents. So this is also something where you will spend a lot of time working on the detail. So good things for accentuations are the Eurosaw I showed you already. Then cymbals work very fine, and also stabs and hits. We already had an orchestral hit in the synth hook part, and for the chorus I wanted to add a different hit sound which comes from the Korg 01W. It is a sample I use with the NNXT sample player in Reason. And the Korg orchestral hit sounds like this. The attack is a bit slower than the one from Halion Sonic. Also I removed the release, so on shorter notes it is cut off at the end. Which is very nice for accentuations. I also use the hits as a transition from the chorus to the hook.
You are all in the streets, but unlike the fromage in the sheets.
So the rest of the chorus is basically made of elements which you already heard before in the song, like the pads and the drums. The drums play here the same pattern as in the verse and the pre-chorus, except for some later parts where some variation comes in. So let's take a look at the third chorus, because this one is different from the first 2 chorus parts. Here the first 8 bars of the chorus just have one single bass drum at the beginning for the accent and then no drums at all. Also there is no bass in these 8 bars. The bass and the drums come back in the second part of the chorus.
And the wine will be delivered in no time. Merci, I will be.
I still kept the offbeat synth, so we have at least one offbeat element still. Another variation could be just to keep the hi-hat in the offbeat, or just to keep the bass, or maybe keep two of them but not all of them at once. Also, the 16th synth doesn't play in the first 8 bars, so I really tried to keep the rhythmic elements low, and then after 8 bars they all come back, the drums and the bass. And of course also the 16th synth, which I forgot to click. So let's have a look at the transitions now, because the last chorus is pretty much the same as the first and the second chorus, so there's not much to talk about. Well, transitions are important after the second chorus, because there is only repetition afterwards, and we need to get some variety into the song to keep it interesting. One could also make a completely different part which comes afterwards, but this is not necessary. You can already get a lot of interesting stuff with just playing around with some variation and using different transitions. So I decided to add another comedic element to the song, because it is, of course, a comedic song. And I thought it may be a nice idea after the second chorus and the synth hook which comes afterwards to use the Twingo horn sound as an offbeat sound, together with bass drum and hi-hat. By the way, I also found the horn sound on YouTube. And I didn't use a sampler for that, I just put the audio into the DAW and put it at the right place. So to do this I used a different grid pattern so I could easily put it on the offbeats. And then it sounds like this. And for the other transition, which comes after the third chorus and synth hook afterwards, I decided to play around with the synth sounds from the hook a bit. But I decided to play something which hasn't been played in the rest of the song. So we got another unique part here. For that I only used 3 of the melodic synths, but I made another difference because this time they don't play single notes only, but some kind of chords too. So without adding new sounds to the song, we got another variation to it. So yeah, these transitions are really all about creativity, and the possibilities are almost unlimited. Of course, I can't go into every detail of mixing and mastering in such a short tutorial, like explaining all the effects I used and so on. But I can show you one approach to mixing, and hopefully it will help you to get an idea of how to get a good sounding song. So what I usually do for mixing is to give every sound I use a single track. Many multi-timbral VSTs support multiple outputs as well, so that you can use a different output and mixer channel for each sound. But you will have to activate them manually, which you can do in a drop-down menu. I don't know how it works in other DAWs though. So if you're using Fruity Loops for example, you have to find out by yourself. It's also important to route the sounds in the plugin itself to the outputs you want. Also, to get a better overview when mixing, you may want to rename the outputs to the sound you use or to the category of sound, whatever is the easiest for you. It may take some time at the beginning, but it will save you a lot of time later in the mixing process. And trust me, I have experience with that. Because I can be very lazy too. So renaming mixer tracks in Cubase is pretty easy. You just have to double click them and then type in whatever you want to name them. And if you keep the plugin open like this, you can easily look at how the patches are called. So it's really not that time consuming, but absolutely time saving later. Also, you don't have to write the full names of the patches. I only do that because when I export the multitrack files from my Patreon, it makes them easier to understand. So make the same thing with the drums, and then I'm gonna get into the details of mixing the song. So I'm gonna solo the track and then listen what sound plays through what channel. So that's obviously a crash cymbal. But I'm gonna keep the name drums because it's the same name as the track, which is a specialty of Cubase's instrument tracks. Well, okay, this is the kick drum or bass drum. And then the third one is obviously the hi-hat. Yeah. So now our tracks are organized in the sense that we can easily identify them, which is already good. If you like, you can also use colors for grouping certain sounds or move the positions of the tracks, but I think like this it works pretty well for me. And so let's have a look at the drums. I see there's some equalizing, which is weird for a cymbal, but I think it's because we have that samples from the Allman Brother loop which run through the same track, I guess. Yeah. Alright, so it makes sense, and it also makes sense to keep the name drums for that track then. So I use a reverb on the cymbals and the loop sounds, and it is a chorusing short reverb with 35% of mix. So they sound a bit more atmospherical. Yeah, this is nice. It is always good to add some reverb on sounds which you use for special effects. So for the kick I only use a bit of equalizing and an envelope shaper to get a bit more of attack. Let me show you the difference. It is in fact very subtle, but you will hear the difference very clear when the bass drum plays together with the rest of the song. Like this.
My croissant fell to the ground when the engine played that happy sound from the...
So that little bit more of attack really makes it stand out in the song, which is important. I think you can hear it better when I turn up the mastering effects, which I should do anyway. Yeah, subtlety is an important aspect of mixing, and it's not easy in the beginning, but you will get into it. So the kick drum sample already has a nice balance of frequencies, so I only use a bit of equalizing on around 90 Hz, where the low frequencies sound a bit more aggressive. When you go for lower frequencies, you get more rumble. And I prefer to use a bell equalizer because with the shelf I would raise all frequencies below, and that would be too much. Also, I want to keep some parts of the low frequencies for the bass, so they don't interfere too much with each other. So for the hi-hat I cut a bit the very high frequencies and raise the frequencies, well, mostly around 10 kHz, somewhere there. It's mostly where you get that nice snap. So when I mix rhythmic genres like Eurobeat, I prefer to start with the drums, because good drum balance is very important for the rhythm, of course. So yeah, the kick needs a lot of power because it plays in the low frequencies. But you also need a lot of power for the hi-hat, because in Eurobeat it's really important for the offbeat pumping. Another thing you should look for is the release and sustain of the kick. Because it should be almost over when the bass comes in. Otherwise the song would lack definition in the low frequencies and it wouldn't sound good with a good subwoofer. So as I played a crash in the same track as the loop drums, I had to adjust the volume in the plugin and not in the mixer. So when I got the drums, then the next thing I do is try to get the balance between kick and bass. A good kick-bass balance is the key to a nice pumping rhythm. So let's have a look at the bass first. So while it is quite linear, there are some very low frequencies which are too strong, so I put a low cut at the very low end of the sound. So I cut the bass at around 40 Hz, and some people may say, oh, my subwoofer goes as low as 20 Hz, but that's nice for some effects, but not necessary for musical bass. Except when you have those huge organ pipes. So yeah, I try to keep the frequencies below 200 Hz as linear as possible. And as you can see, there is a small hole at 90 Hz, so I raise it a bit there. I got no other effects on the bass because it sounds already very fine. But I would use a sidechain compressor with the kick as input if I would use a different pattern than the simple offbeat. Sidechaining means that you use an audio signal as a trigger for an effect. So if you put a compressor on the bass and use the kick as a trigger, every time there is a kick, the bass will be quieter depending on your compressor settings. So this is important if you want to keep it pumping with a more complex bass line. Okay, then let's listen to the kick and the bass together. So yeah, I try to keep the bass and the kick at around the same volume. Otherwise, one of the two would lack power, like this. So you can hear the kick doesn't kick anymore. And when the kick is too loud, the pumping effect is gone. So okay, now I have to try to return it to the old settings, but I won't save the song after the tutorial anyway, so nothing of the original song will be gone. But yeah, you hear how important a good balance of kick and bass already is for a good rhythm. So now that we got that, I think the next step should be to adjust the other rhythmic elements. So let's go to Reason and set the Offbeat Synth. I'm gonna solo just the tracks that we need for that. And now you see why a good organization is so important. Here is the mixer channel of Reason. So as Reason has its own mixer, I'm gonna adjust the volume and the sound of the Offbeat Synth in Reason and not in Cubase. Cubase only gets the stereo sum from Reason. So here it is, the Offbeat Synth. So there's something that shouldn't play here. Yeah, no, that's right. So as you can hear, it is not really loud, but that's also not necessary because it should only fill the frequencies between the bass and the hi-hat, so the offbeat part is really in the full range of frequencies. It gives a bit the effect of a snare, as it would be in other genres, which also gives the impression of very high speed in Eurobeat. So a snare also uses a very broad band of frequencies. So that's probably why it's so important to have the full band. So I can say for most of the synth patches I don't use much effects or equalizing because I try to use sounds that are already very well balanced. And that's the case with most modern synths anyway. But when I use old synths like the DX7, there's maybe a bit more to do because it has no effects at all. So it still needs reverb, delay, chorus, anything. What is important though is some low cutting and high cutting sometimes, because anything that plays below 150 Hz should be only kick and bass and nothing else. So if a synth basically plays high tones and still has some low frequencies, that's not something which is important for the music, but it can ruin your whole bass balance, and so you have to get rid of it. So that's mostly what low pass and high pass filters are for. You can also use those filters with an automation, but I don't use it in this song, so it makes no sense to explain it here. So yeah, the 16 synth had very annoying frequencies in the highs and in the lows. So one instrument that needs a lot of attention too is the guitar, especially when you got a high gain distorted guitar. Not all frequency bands of it are a pleasure to the ear, so you should closely listen to what sounds good and what not. So here I had to lower some of the low frequencies and raise some of the high mids. That's because I wanted a rather sharp sound. So an electric guitar sounds really sharp around 3 kHz. But take care, as it can also interfere with the vocals. The lowering of the low frequencies is because I want to give room for the bass and kick in this band. Still, I don't cut it completely in a guitar because there are still some musical tones in that range. So if you have to do a cut, do it below 80 Hz for a guitar. I also added some reverb, delay and chorus to the guitar. You wouldn't want to do that for straight dry modern metal sound, but here I wanted to have more of an 80s stadium rock feeling, and for that it is really necessary to add some nice atmospheric effects. The original patch only has distortion and equalizer. And now let's go to the most difficult part of mixing, the vocals. Vocals are difficult to mix because you have a high dynamic range, and also you don't only want to be able to hear the vocals, but also to understand them. So there is no real formula for vocal mixing. You would do completely different things for a jazz ballad than for a Eurobeat song. Around 200 Hz the vocals sound warm. Around 1 kHz you have a good vowel understanding, but it can sound like a telephone voice easily. And in the higher frequencies you have most of the consonants. But what you have to do here depends highly on the vocalist, their articulation, the microphone. So the only advice I can give you is to play around until it sounds good. For Eurobeat mixing I use quite a lot of dynamic processors. This is important because you want to be able to hear the vocals clearly and powerful in a very stuffed arrangement. The chain I use is compressor, de-esser, tape saturation, limiter, and then EQ at the end of the chain. For the compressor I use a threshold depending on the input volume, but always a very high ratio, lowest attack and release, and much makeup gain to get the volume back. The attack and release should be low because I don't want to get too many artifacts on the vocals. When you turn them up, the compressor reacts slower, and that has a huge impact on the transients. But as vocals naturally have very strong transients, you rather want to reduce them. So let's have a listen to the vocals with just the compressor on, and I will show you how it changes when I play with those settings. So you get an idea if you aren't already familiar with it.
My way home from the boulangerie, I saw a special car and it smiled to me. My croissant fell to the ground when the engine played that happy.
For the de-esser I mostly keep the standard settings. Many de-esser plugins come with settings for male and female singers because the hiss and sh aren't at the exact same frequency band. The tape saturation gives just a bit of a warm analog feel to the sound, with a slight saturation, and the limiter does the same as the compressor, but with an unlimited ratio, so everything louder than the threshold limit will be completely cut off. Absolutely necessary for a Eurobeat mix. You should also use a low release setting or use auto release if you got it. Here I use a low input setting because of the high makeup gain from the compressor. Many dynamic range plugins also give an animated display of the actual gain reduction.
from the boulangerie. I saw a special car and it smiled.
This is quite useful if you don't want to trust your ears alone and also want to see how extreme the effects you use are working on the sound. The de-esser functions like a compressor or limiter too, but only on a certain band, the one where the s and sh sounds are. So it reduces that frequency band when it is too sharp, and opposite to an EQ, which reduces everything in that band. So with the low frequency setting, you set the beginning point of the band, which is around 4 kHz here. And with the high frequency setting, you set the high limit of the band, which is around 15 kHz here. So yeah, that's quite an extreme setting, and you will hear some producers say that extreme settings aren't good, it's all about subtlety and so on. But in my opinion, that's bollocks. I rather go with, if it sounds good, then it is good. Also important for vocals are atmospheric effects like reverb and delay. I tend to go with more delay than reverb. A strong reverb on vocals can be nice in some circumstances, but often it makes them more difficult to mix with the instrumental. You can also use a slight chorus effect for more atmosphere. Also, I did some automation on a second delay just for some parts in the chorus to give them a stronger accentuation. Here you can see what the automation actually does. So let's listen to it.
Merci Twingo, the baguette.
Sorry, that made no sense at all because I soloed the track when the effect was on bypass, and in that case Cubase doesn't solo the effects channel with it. But you will hear the effect when I play the vocals with the rest of the song. Just look at what the automation does and listen closely and you will hear the go of Twingo gets a stronger echo effect. Let me show you first in solo mode how I adjust the reverb. I mute every other effect first and then set the reverb to a position where I can only just hear it in solo mode.
Twingo, the baguette and the wine will be delivered in no time. Merci Twingo, tell me quelle est ta couleur, you smell like parfum de fleurs. Merci Twingo.
Then it should be perfect in the mix. So let's listen to everything together and then you can also hear the automated echo effect. So that's it for the lead vocals. Then let's go to the background vocals, which use not so many effects, because I want to keep the dynamic range higher to give the vocals a bit more life. I don't use a limiter here and also not the tape saturation, but I use a compressor with the same settings as in the lead vocals and also a de-esser. EQing is also different because I like to give every background vocal track a different peak frequency so they can stand out a bit in the mix without being too intrusive. Also, I use some low cutting as in the lead vocals to get rid of plobs, mostly around 100 or 80 Hz. But that really depends on the vocal range. The higher the vocals are, the higher you can go with the low cut. But with the deep voice you would also cut some musical parts which wouldn't be so good. So then mostly I use a group track or a VCA fader to mix the background vocals all together. Because while some settings have to be made individually, some others are the same for all, and it makes it easier to mix the background vocals with the rest once they are well balanced with each other. Also, I use some panorama settings to spread them in the room, while the lead vocals are always at the center. So let's take a look at the group settings for the background vocals together. So here we have another equalizer and also we have the send effects here, but not the insert effects. For the background vocals we can give a bit more of reverb than on the lead vocals.
Everybody say, Merci Twingo, the baguette and the wine will be delivered in no time. Merci Twingo, tell me quelle est ta couleur, you smell like parfum de fleurs. Merci Twingo.
As you can hear, the stronger reverb makes them go more in the background, which totally makes sense as they are background vocals. And yeah, then we also have the lead effects track, which is the lead vocals with a distortion. I already talked about the distortion in part 3, where I talked about the verse and pre-chorus. So I used a special effects sound of guitar rig, which is called Screaming Psyche. And it also has a very weird delay effect, which I had to reduce a bit. Then the rest is almost the same settings as in the lead vocals, just without the saturation, because we already have the distortion from guitar rig, and that's already enough. So now that we also done the vocals and all the synths are pretty well balanced, there is another thing to do, which is the mastering. Because we want the song to be loud enough and not have any digital clipping when we export it. My mastering chain here begins with a multiband compressor. They are quite difficult to handle, and if you don't feel comfortable with it yet, I recommend to use a simple compressor. But learning to use a multiband is something you should put on your schedule if you want to do some serious mastering. You can also use the presets if they sound good to you, and that's also what I do. Use a preset and then make some slight changes around them. But that totally depends on the plugins and the presets available, of course. The multiband is also useful for checking the kick-bass balance, as you can solo all the different bands. If you solo the lows, you can listen how well it pumps in the lowest frequencies. So let's do that right now, so you can hear how a well-balanced low end of a Eurobeat song should sound like, if it's done right. And if there's a thing I'm totally confident about, it's that. So, of course, this is very dull, but you should really be able to hear an impact on the kick as well as on the offbeats. If that doesn't happen, something is not right and you should check the volumes, the sidechain if you use one, and also the sustain of the kick and bass. After the compressor, I use an EQ to get the right balance of frequencies for the master. But before I do that, I also load a spectrum analyzer, because during the mixing and mastering process, your ears get used to what they hear, so it's better also to see what happens. So here we have a strong focus on mids, and we need more energy in the highs and lows. I use shelves for that, and also peaks to adjust the mids a bit.
Merci Twingo, quelle est ta couleur, you smell like parfum de fleurs. Merci Twingo.
I think that's a quite nice balance. The mids are still strong, but that's natural, because that's where most sounds of the song happen. I like to raise the frequencies around 2 kHz a bit, because it gives the mix a little bit more presence. But that also depends on the song, so you have to play around a bit and seek for the right frequency to adjust. Also, I lower the low mids a bit because they tend to sound muddy. So it's nice to lower them to give the song a bit more of transparency.
When you are coming near, you make everyone sourire. Merci Twingo, you are on.
Now the song sounds good, but we still need to get the right loudness and volume for the export. That's what we need a brick wall limiter for. I use Voxengo Elephant because it can make a song very loud without giving it too many artifacts. I'm generally not a fan of the loudness war, but I think for certain electronic music styles, loud mastering can add a lot to the sound, and it really is part of what makes a sound great. So I'm also not against it. With the Elephant plugin, you not only get a limiter, but also a dithering, a DC filter, and some useful statistics for the peak and RMS levels. I set the metering to dBFS +3 because that's the standard most songs are measured when it comes to loudness comparisons. As a bass, I use the setting Master's Punch +6. Then I adjust the settings to my needs. I activate the DC filter, which takes care that no direct current shift is in the final mix. I keep the standard setting, but if your export still shows some DC offset, you should play around with the settings until it's gone. This is a technical thing and you won't hear the difference, but it's still important. And the same goes with dithering. Dithering is needed when you export a song to a different bit depth. If you want to make a CD, you will go with 16-bit, but when your song is recorded in 24-bit, you will need to set a dithering so you won't get any strange things on your sound. I can't explain that in detail here, but you really should use that whenever you export a song, even though you probably can't hear any difference. The gain settings on the limiter depend on the input. Mostly I set the output of the EQ to something that the highest peaks are not too far from 0 dB. In this case I had to adjust the volume. This is not unusual for me because, as you may have already noticed, I keep the tracks rather low in volume, so I always have enough headroom. I keep the outgain at minus 0.3 dB, so there's always a little room for some peaks, which you can't always avoid, especially in high frequencies. I keep the release as low as possible and the input gain at around 9 dB, which depends on the input volume, of course. So this is how the final master sounds like.
When you are coming near, you make everyone sourire. Merci Twingo. You are all in the streets, but unlike the fromage in the sheets.
So you can hear the difference with the limiter on or off is quite drastic. If you want to get the multitrack and MIDI for this and my other songs, you should become my patron on Patreon. For $15 a month you will get all of them. See ya!